It was the kind of summer afternoon that seemed to move in slow motion, the air thick with heat and the quiet hum of expensive stillness. The Whitmore estate sat high on the hills, its sprawling white stone walls gleaming under the golden light, surrounded by manicured lawns that looked more like paintings than grass. It was a place where perfection wasn't just expected, it was purchased. The Whitmores were the kind of wealthy that didn't need to tell you they were wealthy. Everything around them spoke for itself. Down by the pool, sunlight shimmered over the water's surface, casting ripples of light across the marble deck. It was the kind of pool you saw in magazines, Olympic-sized, tiled in deep sapphire, framed with glass railings so nothing could obstruct the view of the horizon. To most people it was a place of luxury. But to one girl, it was both sanctuary and danger. Her name was Brielle Whitmore. 17 years old, the only child of the Whitmore fortune, and known throughout the neighborhood not for her beauty, but for the quiet tragedy that shadowed her every move. A car accident when she was 10 had left her partially paralyzed, her legs no longer able to carry her the way they once had. For Brielle, every step required effort, every movement was calculated, measured, and deliberate. But despite the odds, she was stubborn about living as normally as she could. And part of that was spending time by the water. The household staff knew Brielle's routine. Every afternoon after her physical therapy, she'd make her way to the pool in her motorized chair, wearing oversized sunglasses and a silk robe. She loved the sound of the water, the smell of chlorine, the way the sunlight made her skin feel warm. But she also had a habit of wanting space, sending the staff away so she could be alone with her thoughts. It was a rule most followed without question. Except for one person. Marcus. He was the janitor's son. 17, tall and lean, with a kind of quiet presence that blended into the background. His father, Mr. Turner, had been working for the Whitmores for over 20 years, cleaning the estate and keeping the grounds in shape. Marcus had grown up around the property, helping his dad with odd jobs in the summers. But in a house where the staff's children weren't supposed to mingle with the family, Marcus had learned early to keep his distance. That day, Marcus had been sweeping the back terrace, far enough to be out of sight, but close enough to hear the faint splash of water from the pool. The heat pressed against his back, sweat soaking through his shirt, and for a moment he considered ducking inside for a drink. But something, a sound almost imperceptible, made him pause. It was sharp, muffled, and wrong. He turned his head toward the pool. From where he stood, he couldn't see much, just the glitter of water and the edge of Brielle's chair. But the sound came again, this time a frantic splash, followed by silence. Marcus's heart tightened. He dropped the broom. Rounding the corner he froze. Brielle was in the water. Her sunglasses floated a few feet away, spinning slowly in the ripples. Her arms flailed weakly before slipping beneath the surface, her body twisting in the heavy blue stillness. Marcus didn't think, there wasn't time to think. He kicked off his shoes, vaulted over the railing and dove headfirst into the pool. The water closed over him like glass, cool and suffocating all at once. He pushed downward, eyes open, vision blurry against the sting of chlorine. Brielle's pale figure was sinking fast, her hair fanning out like dark smoke in the water. He reached her just as her body went limp. Breaking the surface, Marcus dragged her toward the edge, his breath ragged, every muscle burning. He hauled her onto the deck, water pouring from her clothes, her chest still. Panic clawed at him, but he forced himself to remember what he'd learned years ago in lifeguard training at the community center. He tilted her head back, pressing air into her lungs, willing her to breathe. Seconds stretched into an eternity. And then, a cough. A desperate, choking gasp. Brielle's chest rose, water spilling from her lips as her eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear clouding them. Marcus exhaled, his hands still on her shoulders, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Up at the house, footsteps thundered toward the pool. The estate staff came rushing out, gasps and shouts filling the air. Marcus stepped back, his wet clothes clinging to his skin, his own breath still uneven. The butler dropped to his knees beside Brielle, calling for the Whitmores. And just like that, Marcus faded into the background again, standing on the far side of the pool, dripping and silent, watching the chaos unfold. He didn't yet know that this single act, done without hesitation, was about to set in motion a storm that would change everything for both their families. The Whitmores returned home before sunset. Their car, a long black luxury sedan, rolled silently up the curved driveway, its tinted windows reflecting the last streaks of gold in the sky. Inside there was no sense of panic, no rush. They hadn't yet been told what happened. But the moment the doors opened and Mrs. Whitmore stepped onto the marble steps, she knew something was wrong. The air felt charged, heavy with the kind of silence that meant the staff were holding their breath. By then Brielle was inside, wrapped in a towel and resting in the lounge. The color had returned to her cheeks, but her hair was still damp, and her eyes, wide and unfocused, told a story her lips hadn't yet formed. Her mother froze in the doorway, taking in the scene. The butler began to speak, but Brielle's voice cut through, quiet but steady. She told her mother the truth. She'd fallen into the pool and Marcus had saved her. The room seemed to contract around that sentence. Marcus had been standing in the back, near the kitchen door, his presence barely acknowledged. The moment Brielle said his name, all eyes turned to him. For the first time since pulling her from the water, he felt the weight of the act. Not the physical strain but the shift in the room, how every pair of eyes seemed to measure him differently now. Mrs. Whitmore crossed the room with calculated grace. She stopped in front of him, her gaze unreadable, as if searching for the right way to frame her gratitude. She said thank you. But it wasn't warm. It was polite. Distant. Like thanking someone for returning a lost item, not for saving your child's life. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Marcus helped his father gather tools, cleaned up the terrace, and slipped away before the sun fully set. The Whitmore estate always felt big, but that night, it seemed enormous, every hallway echoing with whispers. By the next morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. The staff who had seen him dive into the pool told others, who told friends, who told neighbors. The gardener's wife was overheard telling someone at the market that the Whitmore girl would be dead if it wasn't for the janitor's boy. It was the kind of tale people loved. Money, tragedy, and an unlikely hero. Marcus wasn't used to attention. At school he kept his head down, stuck to his small circle of friends, and avoided anything that might put him in the spotlight. But now eyes followed him in the hallways. Some kids clapped him on the back, called him lifeguard or hero. Others, those who lived in the wealthy part of town, looked at him with something closer to suspicion, like they couldn't quite accept that he'd been the one to act when no one else did. The thing about small towns is that stories don't just spread, they grow. By Wednesday there were already 3 different versions of what happened. In one, Marcus had been lounging by the pool like he owned the place. In another, Brielle had been trying to impress him only to slip. And in the ugliest version, whispered by kids whose parents worked for the Whitmores, Marcus had pushed her in just so he could save her. That one hit him like a punch to the gut. Marcus didn't care much for gossip, but this felt different. It wasn't just idle talk, it was an attempt to rewrite what had happened. And in a town where the Whitmores' influence ran deep, the wrong version of the story could stick. Meanwhile, at the estate things were shifting. Brielle had been quieter than usual, not just from the shock of what happened, but from the undercurrent she could feel in her own home. Her father hadn't spoken to Marcus directly. Instead, he'd instructed the butler to handle it, as though saving her life was a minor inconvenience to be wrapped up with the rest of the day's business. But Brielle noticed things. The way Marcus had stayed in the background, dripping wet, while everyone else rushed to her side. The way he'd left without waiting for thanks or praise. And she noticed something else. How, after the incident, the staff seemed to watch her more closely, their eyes flicking to the pool whenever she rolled by. Late one afternoon she overheard her parents talking behind the closed door of her father's study. She couldn't make out every word, but she heard enough. Optics, boundaries, grateful, but the conversation ended with the same phrase her father always used when something was to be quietly dealt with: "We'll take care of it." What it meant she wasn't sure. But she would find out soon enough. And Marcus? He had no idea yet that forces much bigger than gossip were starting to move against him. The call came early in the morning, before the sun had burned away the last traces of dawn. Mr. Turner was already dressed for work, the smell of coffee filling the small kitchen, when the Whitmore estate's number lit up his phone. He answered in the same calm tone he always used with the family, but something in the clipped voice on the other end told him this wasn't a routine request. By noon, both father and son were standing in the Whitmore's study. It was a room built for intimidation, walls lined with dark wood, shelves of leather-bound books, and a massive desk that seemed to swallow the space between whoever sat behind it and whoever stood before it. Mr. Whitmore didn't bother with small talk. His gaze was sharp, his words precise. Gratitude, yes, but also a subtle undercurrent, something that made Marcus's stomach twist. He spoke about boundaries and professional distance. About how the Whitmores valued the staff, but also needed to maintain clear lines. The thanks for saving Brielle's life was there, but it was wrapped in layers of control, like a gift handed over in a box you weren't allowed to open. Then came the offer. A scholarship. A generous one. Full tuition to a private school across town, transportation covered, everything taken care of. On paper, it was the kind of opportunity people prayed for. But there was an unspoken condition. Marcus would no longer be working on the estate. No sweeping the terrace, no fixing the garden lights, no summer spent alongside his father in the quiet corners of the property. And most importantly, no contact with Brielle. Mr. Turner understood immediately. It was a way to thank without elevating. To remove Marcus from the orbit of the Whitmore daughter without making it look like punishment. His father's silence spoke volumes. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a decision already made. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his mind tangled. He didn't want their money, their schooling, or their polite distance. He hadn't saved Brielle to earn a reward. But refusing outright? That would put his father's job in jeopardy. And in the Whitmore's world, jeopardy wasn't a word you played with lightly. When they left the study, Mr. Turner's hand was heavy on his son's shoulder, a quiet reminder to keep his head down. "We don't make trouble," his father had always said. "We survive by staying useful and staying silent." It was a rule that had kept them steady for years. But Marcus could feel the edges of it fraying now. Over the next few days he worked the estate less and less. Tasks that had once been handed to him were now reassigned to other staff. He noticed how the butler's eyes lingered on him longer than before, how certain hallways seemed to close off when he approached. Even Brielle's usual afternoon by the pool became rare. On the few occasions he caught sight of her, she was surrounded, nurses, maids, always someone within arm's reach. Word about the scholarship began to circulate in town, and with it came more whispers. Some saw it as a reward, others as a bribe. The wealthier families framed it as a charitable gesture, proof of the Whitmores' generosity. Those who knew better kept their opinions quiet, but Marcus could see the skepticism in their eyes. Brielle, meanwhile, had her own thoughts. She had pieced together enough from the tension in her parents' voices, the sudden disappearance of Marcus from the estate, and the brittle politeness of the staff when his name came up. She knew her family well enough to recognize the signs. They were controlling the story. One late afternoon, she wheeled herself to the edge of her balcony overlooking the pool. The water glittered in the fading sunlight, calm and still, betraying nothing of the chaos it had caused. She thought of the moment she'd gone under, the fear, the weight of the water pressing in, and then the arms that had pulled her out, steady and certain. She thought of how quickly those arms had been pushed away. Somewhere inside her, something hardened. That night, Marcus sat in his room, the scholarship papers on the desk in front of him. His father's voice echoed in his mind, "We don't make trouble." But the more he stared at the papers, the more he felt the pull of something different. Trouble, maybe. Or truth. The kind you couldn't just file away with polite words and closed doors. The Whitmores thought the matter was handled. They were wrong. Brielle had never been the kind of girl to cause waves, at least, not the kind that reached beyond the marble walls of the Whitmore estate. Her life, since the accident, had been lived within controlled parameters. Scheduled therapy sessions, carefully monitored social events, polite appearances at charity galas. Even her moments of solitude were often observed from a discreet distance. But after the pool incident, that structure began to feel less like protection and more like a cage. Days passed with Marcus nowhere to be seen. The first time she asked about him, the butler gave a tight smile and mumbled something about other opportunities. The second time, her mother deflected entirely, steering the conversation toward an upcoming fundraiser. By the third time, Brielle stopped asking, out loud at least. But inside, her frustration grew. She replayed the scene over and over, the water closing over her, the cold panic in her chest, and then the sudden force pulling her upward. It hadn't been anyone from the train staff, not the lifeguard who was supposed to be on duty, not the security guard stationed just inside the patio doors. It had been Marcus, the janitor's son. The boy whose name her parents now seemed reluctant to even speak. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, she decided she'd had enough. She dismissed her nurse early, claiming she needed rest, and instead wheeled herself toward the service wing. She hadn't been down that hallway in years. It wasn't her space, as her mother put it, but she knew Marcus's father often worked there. The smell of cleaning solution hung faintly in the air. She passed rows of closed doors until she found the small office where the maintenance schedules were kept. It was empty. A single clipboard lay on the desk, pages filled with neat handwriting. She scanned the list until she found his name, Marcus Turner, crossed out with a note in red ink, reassigned off property. Her stomach sank. They hadn't just reduced his work. They had removed him entirely. Back in her room, she pulled out her phone. Most of her contacts were classmates, family acquaintances, or distant relatives, but she also knew a few of the staff's children from charity events. It didn't take long to find someone who knew where Marcus lived. The address was scrawled into a notebook she kept hidden in her bedside drawer. That night, long after the estate had gone quiet, she made her move. She couldn't drive herself, but she could convince one of the younger housemaids, someone whose loyalty leaned more toward Brielle than the Whitmore rules, to arrange a ride. By the time they reached the modest neighborhood on the other side of town, the air was thick with the smell of cut grass and summer heat lingering in the pavement. Brielle's arrival didn't go unnoticed. Curtains shifted. A dog barked in the distance. She spotted Marcus through the open window of a small, worn house, seated at a desk with papers spread before him. The light from inside cast a warm glow on his face, but there was something in his posture, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the page, that spoke of frustration more than focus. She knocked. When Marcus opened the door, the surprise in his eyes was unmistakable. He glanced past her as if expecting her parents to be standing there, ready to drag her back. But they weren't. For the first time since the incident, they were face to face, without the walls of the Whitmore estate between them. The conversation that followed was short, not because they had nothing to say, but because the weight of what hung between them didn't need many words. She told him she knew about the scholarship, about the deal her parents had made. She told him she didn't agree. And then she told him something that shifted the air between them completely. She wanted to see him at the estate again, no matter what her parents thought. For Marcus, the request was dangerous. Accepting it meant walking directly into the center of a conflict he'd been trying to avoid. Refusing it meant letting the Whitmores rewrite the story on their terms. In the end, it wasn't a decision he made out loud. It was the way he didn't close the door when she left. The way his eyes followed her back to the waiting car. The way the papers on his desk remained untouched for the rest of the night, his mind fixed on the spark she'd just lit. Back at the estate, Brielle's mother noticed the shift immediately. Her daughter's mood had changed, less compliant, more deliberate. The walls that kept her safe were starting to crack. And for the Whitmores, cracks had a way of becoming headlines. What they didn't yet realize was that the next time Marcus set foot on their property, it wouldn't be quietly. Marcus didn't return right away. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, the kind that weighs heavy in the chest before it takes shape in action. He knew that stepping foot on the Whitmore estate again would be like walking into the eye of a storm. But Brielle's visit had shifted something in him. She hadn't just thanked him, she'd challenged him. By the end of the week, he was standing at the wrought iron gates once more. His father had been called in for a maintenance issue, and Marcus came along under the pretense of helping with the heavier work. The security guard's eyes narrowed but didn't question it. Old habits of seeing Marcus as part of the estate's fabric hadn't fully faded. The moment he stepped onto the grounds, the difference was palpable. The staff greeted his father politely, but with Marcus, there was hesitation. Some averted their eyes. Others glanced toward the main house as if to gauge whether this was allowed. It was the kind of silent tension you could feel pressing against your skin. Brielle, however, was ready. She positioned herself by the terrace, her motorized chair angled toward the path she knew Marcus would take. The moment she spotted him, her face lit, not with the reserved smile she gave to family friends, but with something warmer, freer. Their reunion wasn't dramatic in gesture, but it was loaded in meaning. Marcus stood beside her, his shadow falling across the marble deck. They spoke in low tones, leaning slightly toward one another, their shared history from that day by the pool an unspoken bond. It didn't take long for the watchful eyes to catch wind of it. The butler appeared within minutes, his measured steps carrying an undercurrent of urgency. He addressed Brielle first, his voice firm but wrapped in the thin veneer of propriety. Marcus could feel the weight of the message even without hearing every word. This isn't proper. This isn't sanctioned. But Brielle didn't move. Instead, she asked for Marcus's help with something. an errand that would take them both through the estate's garden paths. It was an obvious defiance, and the butler knew it. His jaw tightened, but he stepped back, choosing not to make a scene. As they moved along the winding paths, Marcus could see the house from angles he hadn't noticed before. Balconies casting shadows over the manicured hedges, glass windows catching the reflection of the late afternoon sun. He also noticed the figures inside, silhouettes pausing mid-step to watch them pass. What Brielle told him then was more than just an update, it was a warning. She'd overheard her parents speaking with a man from the country club, their words clipped and careful. They weren't just trying to remove Marcus from her life. They were framing the entire event at the pool in a way that erased his role entirely. In their version, staff intervention was delayed but adequate, with Marcus reduced to assisting after the fact. It was clear what this meant. The Whitmores wanted control of the narrative, and Marcus's existence in that story threatened it. By the time they circled back to the terrace, the air had shifted. Mr. Whitmore himself was waiting, his frame tall and imposing against the setting sun. His gaze landed on Marcus like a blade. The conversation that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Mr. Whitmore's words were calculated, each one pressing against Marcus like a test of endurance. He spoke of gratitude again, but this time it was hollow, overshadowed by warnings about boundaries, appearances, and knowing one's place. Brielle cut in before Marcus could respond. She didn't raise her voice, but her tone carried the kind of steel that could shatter glass. She stated plainly that Marcus was her friend, that without him she would be dead, and that any attempt to erase that truth would be a lie. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Mr. Whitmore's eyes shifted between them, his jaw tight. Finally he dismissed them both, but his posture said more than his words. This wasn't over. As Marcus left the terrace, he could feel the invisible lines being drawn deeper into the ground. He had crossed one of them today, on purpose, and there was no stepping back. Back in his small bedroom that night, Marcus replayed the scene in his head. Brielle's defiance had bought them time, but it had also marked them both. The Whitmores weren't the kind of people to lose control without a fight. And Marcus was starting to realize that saving Brielle's life was only the beginning. The retaliation didn't come with sirens or public scenes. The Whitmores didn't work like that. Their power was quieter, sharper, and far more effective. Within a week, the first move was made. Marcus's father received notice that his hours were being reduced for the season. A change that sounded temporary on paper but felt permanent in tone. The estate claimed budget adjustments, though anyone who knew the Whitmores understood that money was never the issue. It was a message: remove Marcus from the picture or risk the stability you've built. Marcus could see the strain on his father's face. Years of loyal service suddenly meant nothing in the shadow of a single act they couldn't control. The scholarship papers were still on Marcus's desk, untouched, a reminder that the Whitmores' version of generosity always came with strings. Meanwhile, Brielle's world was tightening. Her schedule became more rigid, her movements more monitored. The nurse who'd been with her for 2 years was suddenly replaced by someone new, younger, more watchful, reporting back to her mother after every interaction. Invitations to social events were accepted without asking her, as though the pool incident had made her incapable of making decisions. But control only works if both parties agree to it, and Brielle was done agreeing. She began to document everything, every whispered conversation she overheard, every small change to her daily life, every moment her parents tried to rewrite the story. She saved copies of emails, photographed pages from the estate's incident reports, even managed to get the original pool security footage transferred to her phone. And then she told Marcus her plan. It was risky, reckless even, but it was the only way to force the truth into the light. The local paper was holding its annual community feature, a special edition showcasing acts of heroism in the town. Brielle intended to submit the real story, complete with proof, and name Marcus as the one who'd saved her. Not as an assistant, not as a witness, but as the reason she was alive. Marcus hesitated. This wasn't just about credit. This was about defying the Whitmores on their own stage in a way they couldn't quietly erase. Once the story was out, there would be no going back. The night before the submission deadline, they met in the garden. The estate was quiet, the air thick with the scent of jasmine. Marcus handed her the final piece of evidence she needed. His written account of that afternoon, signed and dated. No exaggerations, no dramatics. Just the truth. When the feature was published, it spread faster than either of them expected. The headline ran bold: Local teen saves life of prominent family's daughter. The photograph showed Brielle, seated in her chair holding Marcus's hand. And beneath it, the article detailed the events exactly as they happened, with Brielle's words leaving no room for reinterpretation. The backlash from the Whitmores was immediate. They released a statement thanking Marcus while subtly undermining his account, calling the article well-meaning but oversimplified. But the damage, or in Brielle's eyes the victory, was done. The town knew the truth now, and no amount of polished language could take it back. For Marcus's father, the cost was real. His position at the estate was formally eliminated within the month. But when Marcus looked at him after the news came, he didn't see regret. He saw pride. For once, the Turners hadn't stayed silent. Brielle's relationship with her parents fractured in ways that wouldn't heal quickly. But she didn't regret it. The pool had nearly taken her life. The lies had nearly taken her voice. And Marcus, the boy her parents had tried to erase, had given her both back. The Whitmores would go on, their fortune untouched, their social standing intact. But in their carefully curated world, a permanent crack had formed. The kind you couldn't plaster over without seeing the fault lines beneath. And for Marcus and Brielle that was enough. They had crossed the last line together. The storm had passed, but the air it left behind was clearer than ever. You've been listening to another unforgettable story from Twilight Tales, where the truth cuts deep, and every tale leaves its mark. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next twist. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Whose side would you have been on? Until next time, keep your eyes open, your heart strong, and remember, in the shadows the truth always finds its way out.